Good morning, everybody. I'm Jo Mullins. I'm Associate Director of Global Sustainability at Kimberly Professional. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the Impacts team for having me speak, and also honoured really to be the opening presentation of what is a great agenda of presentations over the next 2 days at the Sustainability School at Interclean. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be covering some of the key trends that we're seeing at Kimberly-Clark that are affecting our industry through this year that we're working on. And these are driving activity, and they're driving new ways of working together, new forms of collaboration as we figure out how are we going to address some of the big sustainability challenges that we're facing. So already in the first few months of 2024, we've seen a large number of extreme weather events. We've seen flooding in California, we've seen wildfires in Chile, we've seen extreme heat in West Africa, and those events have made it really hard for many people to cope and unfortunately claimed quite a number of lives. And the photo you can see at the bottom of the screen is of the town closest to where I live. So in the UK, we also experienced flooding, extreme rain, disruption to transport, and flooding to people's homes. I often see extreme weather events online or on the TV. I'm sure you do too. But it was quite shocking to me to see the town where I go shopping or meet with friends underwater, and for my friends to be telling me about the damage and the cost to their cars and their homes and their furniture. And so we're seeing shifts. We're seeing people recognize the effects that climate change are having, and this is having effects on behavior. More than half of European consumers are choosing to eat less meat. We're driving many more electric vehicles. And our electricity grids are switching to more renewable sources, in particular wind. Wind power actually made up more electricity than gas for the first time in 2023. And in our industry, we're seeing more products made with renewable energy. We're seeing more recycled content in our products and packaging, and product designs that are reducing waste. And these trends are set to continue. So let's zoom in a little bit more to our industry and take a look at the three trends I'm going to focus on that I think are really key in 24. The first one is related to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and the end aim of achieving net zero. Now, the idea behind achieving true net zero is to reduce the emissions we're producing by around 90%. So to achieve a change that significant is going to require commitment, it's going to need a solid plan, and it's going to need us to put decarbonisation as a priority within our activities in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And with such a huge challenge as decarbonising our economies, our thinking and our strategies are constantly developing and evolving as we work out how we're going to navigate this path to net zero. A few years ago, in line with the Paris Agreement, that was 2021, there was a big surge of companies rising to the challenge to name a date when they would declare net zero on or by 2050. Obviously, this was to demonstrate their sustainability leadership and perhaps also to benefit from the effect that has on better brand reputation as well. A major trend that I'm going to talk about now for this year is a recognition that it's not just about when and declaring a date for achieving net zero, it's how, getting into the detail. We're going to need robust, credible, measurable plans for how companies are going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and eventually get to net zero. So from next year, starting this year, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, will be coming into effect. And that will replace the EU's current reporting directive, which is called the NFRD. And the European Union will require all large and listed companies to report on their ESG practices, including topics like pollution and circularity. And climate will be a mandatory topic. Companies will have to declare their annual carbon footprint and have science-based 2030 mitigation targets for their own operations and all of their value chain. Under the current NFRD, reporting is voluntary, but under the new CSRD, it's going to be mandatory. So that means we're all going to have data to provide to external validators, auditors, the likes of Deloitte and McKinsey. So what kind of actions can we expect that to drive? So the new CSRD requires companies to report on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So scope 1 are direct emissions from sources that a company owns and operates. So, for example, burning fuel in our manufacturing or in our fleet vehicles. And companies can reduce these by working in more lean ways of production, by reducing their waste and maintaining their machinery and vehicles well, as well as switching to electric fleet vehicles. Those are the sorts of things we're currently working on to reduce scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 are indirect emissions, and these come from the electricity grid that you're connected to. So, for example, the emissions caused when generating the electricity that we use in our buildings, that would fall under scope 2. And companies can reduce these by purchasing more renewable energy sources instead of fossil fuel generated electricity. They could install motion sensor lighting and increase the insulation of buildings. Those are the sorts of things that we're doing to reduce our scope 2 emissions. But the bigger part, the majority for most companies, lies in scope 3. And for Kimberly Clark, scope 3 is 70% of our emissions. These are the emissions from everything not included in scope 1 and 2, both upstream of our operations and downstream. So, for example, when we buy, use, and dispose of a product from a supplier, or when our customers use and dispose of our products that we've made at the end of their life. Those are all in scope 3. And because these emissions are not directly in our control, they're much harder to manage and track. And it's also more difficult to get hold of accurate, high-quality data about those emissions for tracking and reporting. But there is some good news. So this is what I will call the virtuous circle of emissions. It means that as our suppliers reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, our scope 3 emissions are reduced. So when our suppliers make improvements and updates to their own operations and work on becoming more efficient, they include more recycled content in products or packaging, or select more sustainable modes of transport for logistics. That's all helping to reduce our scope 3 emissions. So, for example, if we work with one of our suppliers to redesign a product so that it packs more efficiently for shipping, that's a great way of reducing our scope 3 emissions. And these initiatives require collaboration. They need us to have matching ambitions and goals with our suppliers and a shared willingness and motivation to innovate and improve. And it's going to need us to share information, data, to track and report on how we're progressing towards our targets. So as companies start to truly understand Scope 3 emissions, this recognition that strong collaboration and working together will be really important. And that's becoming an acknowledgement, a trend that's shaping our supplier relationships and our procurement team's goals. And collaboration will really enable us to unlock and reduce Scope 3 emissions by 2030 under the new CSRD. If we think about between now and 2030 as the short term, what about beyond 2030? Well, back in 2021 at the United Nations COP26 summit, more than 1,000 companies rose to the challenge to commit to setting net zero goals and providing targets for validation by 2023. That date is now passed. So who had the job of checking whether that had been done? Well, that was the role of the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI. And they're an independent body. They develop the standards and the tools and the guidance to enable companies to set targets and plans in line with the ambition to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C over pre-industrial levels, is how it's described. Of the 1,000 companies that had committed to setting net zero targets on or before 2050, 1 in 3 had not submitted them by the deadline, including some very well-known names: Johnson & Johnson, Unilever, P&G. And this led to them being marked as commitment removed on the SBTI website. So if these very reputable and ambitious related to their sustainability agenda companies had their commitments removed, what prevented them from achieving the goal? Well, a big reason is that the SBTI are currently reviewing their corporate net zero standard. Even they are reconsidering how to measure Scope 3 because it's hard and it's complex. So if the experts aren't clear on how to do it, it's not surprising that these companies also are finding it quite difficult. It wasn't lack of ambition, it's lack of clarity. And that came through in research that SBTI conducted. Companies were asked what were the reasons, the barriers they faced when setting a net zero standard. And the top answer was that Scope 3 is just too much of a challenge. So the SBTI is setting a high bar and they're continuing to raise it. And as I've mentioned, Scope 3 is complex and they're hard to control. It's a big challenge for all businesses, and we will really need to work together to figure out how we're going to solve this issue. And you might have wondered on this chart why Kimberly has not set a net zero target beyond 2030 yet. Well, this is because we're working hard on our how and forming our plan. And we'll only submit targets when we are really confident we have a robust plan, we have the capabilities and the resources to deliver on that. So that's why. And in fact, when I recently looked through the SBTI's website, I could see that actually no tissue manufacturers have yet achieved that goal because it's proving to be quite a challenge. So in summary, the CSRD will require European companies, large and listed companies, to set out how they're going to reduce emissions by 2030 and by how much. And companies will be required to create and follow clear carbon reduction plans and report on their progress. There's been quite a realization, a light bulb moment as companies start to develop their plans, that faster change is required to do what we need to do by the timings that we need to do it by, and that working in a collaborative way is going to be essential to reduce our Scope 3 emissions. So the focus now is turning not just from when to how. going to move on to trend number 2, which is regulations. We have a huge wave of regulations coming in Europe, in place already, and coming across the EU. And the focus of these is to increase transparency and accountability around sustainability and to encourage companies to adopt more sustainable practices, which is great. Some of the regulations are also focused on helping to protect investors from greenwashing, which is when a company makes claims about a product that can be misleading. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. A lot of new regulation is coming, so I've not got much time today. I've chosen to focus on 2 pieces that are really key this year, certainly areas that we are focused on currently. And the first one is the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, or EUDR. So this map shows world forest cover in 2004 in the light green colours. And the dark green shows where forests still existed by 2021. There's a massive reduction of 106 million acres during that time. The EUDR comes into effect on the 30th of December this year, and the goal is to protect the world's forests and the release of carbon emissions associated with the consumption and production of forest risk commodities, so things like cattle, wood, oil palm, soy, and also it covers several forest risk derived products such as paper and tissue. The key requirement here is traceability. So companies need to show exactly where commodities were produced or grown, right down to the specific GPS coordinate of the plot. For tissue products, mill level traceability is good, but the EUDR will require traceability right back to their origin. And this means we've got to map our whole supply chain, including our indirect suppliers, which can be quite hard to locate, and to report on that information on an annual basis to show that we are aware of the product's origins, that we are aware of the risks of non-compliance and what steps we're taking to address those risks. So what should we be doing now to prepare? Sharing requirements of the EUDR with suppliers is very important. So we're working together with this required information into a track and trace system, which will make the required data visible for tracking and reporting. The new regulation is going to be challenging to meet, and the penalties for non-compliance are high. But it also creates opportunities for effective collaboration between us and our suppliers to increase traceability and to prevent further global forest loss. Okay, let's take a look at the second piece of regulation, which is the European Union Draft Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, or PPWR. The aims of this new regulation are to reduce packaging pollution, help build a circular economy for packaging, and grow the market for recycled content. The PPWR has been adopted by the European Parliament, but it's not in effect yet, but we expect it will be in the last quarter of this year. PPR is going to set targets to reduce packaging waste per capita. It's going to set specific design requirements for recyclable packaging and use of post-consumer recycled material, or PCR. And it will also set requirements for extended producer responsibility schemes, or EPR, and those schemes will have incentives for more sustainable packaging. So in short, all packaging will need to be recyclable by design, and in practice, brands will need to incorporate more post-consumer recycled material into their plastic packaging. In terms of the timelines for this piece of work, if approved, the regulation will mean that by 2030, all packaging on the EU market must be designed to be recyclable and have a minimum of 35% of PCR content. It will also need to be lightweighted, so make sure that minimisation of packaging becomes the norm by 2030. So in summary, in line with the move towards a European circular economy and our commitments to achieve net zero, we're going to be faced with a lot of regulation. It will bring changes to the way that companies operate and report, including the new European Deforestation Regulation, EUDR, and the new European Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, both of which we expect to be enforced by the end of this year. The third and final trend, goodbye to greenwashing. This is the practice of giving misleading information about a product or making out that it's more green than it actually is. And in March, the European Parliament voted in favour of a new Green Claims Directive. And there are many examples of companies that are already in trouble for greenwashing. For example, putting pictures of flowers or making packaging green to make out that it's more eco-friendly than it is, or ingredients being described as natural or organic, when actually that doesn't apply to the whole product, but just a few ingredients, or overuse of carbon offsets. There's no simple way to easily identify greenwashing, but there are some signs you can look out for, like government-approved certifications, which means the companies must stick to certain rules and principles. So I'm going to wrap up there. And in summary, this year is all about placing focus on creating clear, robust, actionable plans for reducing Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We'll see new regulations coming in to prevent deforestation and reduce packaging waste. And this will require us to work together within our industry to collaborate, innovate, share goals and information as we push forwards towards net zero. So I will be over in the speaker's corner if you'd like to discuss anything that I've talked about this morning. Thank you so much for your time listening, and I hope you have a great time at Interclean. Thank you.